Okay, so Andy, do you want to do your presentation now? I think because I'm sure a lot of these aspects will come back with some of the other after the other presentations, and I'm just wary of time. So, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it'd be nice if we finish by 8:30. So if we look at sort of sort of half-hour slots, but I'm quite happy to sort of go through mine a bit quicker.
Sorry, Andy,
so,
I can't understand a word you're saying. You said something about half. All I heard was
we're going to do this for half an hour, Rona. I've sent you my paper if you want to look at it through the email. So yeah, I think the sort of, just to recap on what Toby's saying, yeah, the idea of the sort of UBI Lab Arts is really to sort of create this sort of discussion about why artists might be behind the idea of UBI, how through arts projects we might be able to sort of broaden and deepen the conversation about it, not just amongst artists, but sort of with our audiences as well. And I was really happy to hear that we're going to have some musicians coming into the conversation as well, because it's kind of, I suppose, the way that I came into it. And I thought, well, maybe it's a nice time just to sort of talk about that. And I wrote a paper or an article that was published in a book called The Art, Politics and the Pamphleteer, which was a sort of collection of different artists and curators' approaches to using pamphlets and publications as a way to sort of change the social fabric. And I used it as my contribution to sort of talk about this journey that I'd been on from picking up this pamphlet in a Leeds record shop called Cops and Robbers to sort of where I'm at now, thinking about how, I don't know, as a musician or as an artist, universal basic income feels like a sort of something that I've got some affinity with. So I realized I was like, oh, I'll do a little sort of presentation about where that's come from.
No, Andy, you've frozen. Is it just me?
No, Andy's gone.
Yeah. Oh, are you back?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm just going to read a paper. I'll also send it to people in case there's any more issues with my internet. So here goes. So the article is called From DIY to UBI, The Political Horizons of a Gig Pamphlet, 1999 to 2017 and beyond. So it was written in 2017. So in 1999, at the age of 18, I moved from Matlock, a small town in the Derbyshire Dales, to the bright lights and gritty streets of Leeds. The move was prompted by a rumour from Yorkshire friends that Leeds had a great DIY or do-it-yourself underground music scene. I didn't know exactly what that meant, but as someone who'd been playing in bands and organising gigs in village halls, snooker clubs and the occasional pub, it sounded both intriguingly exotic and invitingly familiar. Some clarity around the DIY music scene came first for me when in the form of a free gig listing pamphlet called Cops and Robbers that I picked up in a record shop in Leeds. The events listed were organised by non-professional musicians and hobbyist promoters in their free time. They took place in temporary spaces, usually the function rooms of pubs and working men's clubs that would be hired out for the evening. According to Cops and Robbers, the defining characteristic of a DIY gig was that it was not for profit, that the event was run on an almost entirely voluntary basis with an entry fee priced as low as would allow the minimal cost of travel, equipment and room hire to be covered, typically around the £3 or £4 mark with concessions for the unwaged. It was all organised for fun, for love, not money. The precedents for this strand of fiercely independent musical activity can be traced back to the UK punk scene of the late 70s, with Dalston bands The Desperate Bicycles disseminating a do-it-yourself approach to recording, releasing records. This inspired the global anarcho-punk and anarchist hardcore punk scenes of the 1980s and 90s that aimed to extend the practice of autonomy, independence and collectivization into everyday life. In the late 90s and early 2000s, there was substantial crossover between Leeds' DIY music activist and squatting scenes. As such, Cops and Robbers acted for many, myself included, as a gateway to a more politicised perspective on the world and an introduction to Marxist, anarchist, situationist, third-wave feminist and other radical leftist literature and ideas. Through this lens, the DIY approach was seen not just as a fairer, more inclusive and accessible way to organise a gig or event, but as a path towards a more just and sustainable society. Beyond its editorial selection and a few brief, often sardonic introductory sentences, however, Cops and Robbers did not communicate with a didactic or proselytising voice. It was first and foremost a vessel of information, a guide for directing people to local events. Its open policy meant that throughout the 2000s, it became part of a forum for a growing number of musical and artistic communities in Leeds that had varying and often conflicting interpretations of what DIY culture was and the socio-political horizons against which it operated. These ranged from the radical, where the DIY community was thought of as a small-scale utopian experiment in non-capitalist organising, demonstrating that another world was possible, to more conservative interpretations that saw the DIY approach merely as a necessary first stage to entering the culture industry. By the mid to late 2000s in Leeds, it felt to me that the neoliberal entrepreneurial version of DIY had begun to overshadow the radically aspiring roots of the ethos, with DIY mainstays like the Brunel Social Club in Hyde Park becoming professional music venues, and a growing number of self-identified independent and DIY bands from the area garnering mainstream attention and pursuing commercial success. Even the parallel communities in the visual arts, the artist-led scene, had become more entwined with the institutional art world and by extension, its role in cultural gentrification. So as a recent graduate on the search for cheaper rent and living costs, I moved to nearby Bradford. Bradford, like Leeds, was a former centre of the Industrial Revolution and once regarded as the wool capital of the world. Following industrial decline, it fell harder and is commonly perceived as the less fortunate of the two cities, unable to get back on its feet in the same way Leeds had achieved through reinvention and regeneration. Fortunately, for seekers of grassroots and subaltern culture like myself, such minor cities also tend to be a breeding ground for informal, alternative and autonomous practices, or artistic dark matter, as Gregory Schlett has described it. So I'll just skip through kind of like the various bits about why Bradford's an interesting place, but it does have sort of some very key venues that were set up by unwaged people, like the, am I back? Yeah, did I freeze a little bit there? Yeah. So yeah, one of the kind of main key things in Bradford for me was this, the 1 in 12 club, which still exists today, which was set up by the Claimants Union, basically by unwaged people in the early 80s and still exists today as an autonomous social centre. The legacy of cross-pollination between art, activism and grassroots activity is still present in the underground arts and music events I experienced in Bradford in the early 2010s. They tended towards an open, collective use of resources with an emphasis on inclusion and participation across discipline and experience, and tended to attract smaller but more diverse audiences than parallel events in Leeds. Club nights, events, parties, exhibitions and activities took place in temporary and community spaces, making for a characterful but often hard to find and therefore relatively small and fragile scene. I was given the opportunity through my role as a fellow in music at University of Bradford between 2012 and 2015 to shine a light on this underground activity with the hope of making it more visible and accessible to students. I did this through a music programme that included citywide festivals, joining up the wealth of underground activity, and by supporting a student-led society to get involved as active participants. I found, however, that increasing participation, broadening and diversifying the DIY community was not as straightforward as simply creating or signposting opportunities. It was clear that students and young people in Bradford were operating under very different circumstances to those I'd experienced in Leeds a decade earlier. Specifically, they had less time, less money, and less entitlement to take part. Of course, this scenario, although perhaps more apparent, wasn't unique to Bradford. The managed reduction in free time for all but the most privileged has been part of the political agenda of austerity that has been forcibly applied across the globe since the financial crash of 2008. In this sense, the overarching issue for radically aspiring DIY and self-organised activity today is not only how people might use existing time towards socially transformative ends, but also how that free time can be reclaimed, or created for potential participants. So one proposed solution to this challenge, as we've talked about today, is universal basic income, which I don't really need to explain the details of. But I guess a key bit for me is that recipients of UBI would be able to choose rather than be obliged to engage in waged labour. Accordingly, it's a means by which to produce free time and make the communist dream of being a fisherman in the morning and a philosopher in the evening, or in the recipients are likely to use the newly gained free time they have engaging in productive community activities rather than self-serving or consumptive leisure. Although I'd make a little footnote that I don't think any of these pilot schemes have really specifically looked at artistic or creative activity. So whilst it undoubtedly sits awkwardly with the DIY aspiration to autonomy from both market and state, UBI would be an effective floor from which a larger and more diverse range of people could participate in self-organised activity. We can imagine then how a world in which basic income has been implemented would foster the proliferation and growth of DIY communities. So UBI would be good for DIY. UBI, however, is still a far stretch from reality. And as we've sort of just talked about before, it's difficult to imagine exactly how it would be implemented without it just happening ever at the same time. So I'd like to consider the role that existing DIY organisers or communities may play in both achieving and modelling this future. This requires us to think about UBI and DIY not only as alternative organisational structures, but as political demands for equality. And if I've got another 5 minutes, I'll carry on reading this, and I'm not breaking up too much. It's okay? Okay. So in 2014, the Institute for Precarious Consciousness theorised that each phase of capitalism has produced a reactive effect. Under industrial capitalism, this was misery, and in the post-Fordist era, it was broaden. The DIY scene I encountered in the early 2000s through Cops and Robbers celebrated its fluidity, lack of rules, unpredictability, and precariousness as radical traits. And I think anyone that was sort of involved in that sort of 90s underground and the sort of anarchic kind of vibe of it all would sort of recognise that. It was nomadic, ever-changing, and emphasised productivity and participation through its injunction to get involved. As a tactic for fighting the boredom of the post-Fordist era, this made sense. But as the Institute for Precarious Consciousness proposed, is perhaps now a solution to a past problem. And they say, in contemporary capitalism, the dominant reactive effect is anxiety. It has become the linchpin of subordination. What we now need is a machine for fighting anxiety, and this is something we do not yet have. I'd suggest, however, that a roadmap for this anxiety fighting machine can be found within the spaces of contemporary DIY culture, which have increasingly ameliorative agendas. Many of the gigs listed in Cops and Robbers in 2017 took place, not in temporary or hired spaces, but in venues set up by and for the DIY community. The archetype for this is the aforementioned 1 in 12 club in Bradford, owned and run by its members for more than 30 years. But even in the increasingly commercialised and competitive environs of Leeds, the DIY community managed to carve out its own space. Wharf Chambers Cooperative Club, for example, was formed in 2011 with, and this is a quote, to provide an inclusive and affordable space for music, art, film, politics, and discussion that brings together people from communities across Leeds. Like other autonomous DIY spaces that have emerged across the UK in recent years, Wharf Chambers employs a Safer Spaces agreement and hosts a programme of events and activities that aim to provide a platform for underrepresented and vulnerable groups, as well as educating its members and visitors about social and political injustices and what to do about it. Emphasis has been placed on identifying and removing the barriers that have blocked participation and representation across gender, sexuality, race, ability, and class. This has not been at the expense of overlooking economic obstacles, with many door prices for events displayed with the caveat that no one will be turned away due to lack of funds. And this is the kind of the language that is getting used on a lot of sort of gig flyers around that time, rather than pay as you feel. Basically, no one will be turned away due to lack of funds. So if the pages of Cops and Robbers once pointed towards spaces in which desires for self-management, autonomy and freedom were put into practice at a local level, they now guide us towards places where those desires have a more communitarian accent. Does this shift in emphasis from individual freedom to social solidarity, from do it yourself to do it together, open up the possibility for channeling and scaling up these desires at the political level? I would suggest yes, and that the linking of DIY and UBI as twin political demands would have a doubling impact. Firstly, a strong body of support and advocacy could come from young people engaged in DIY culture, the sort of musicians that we might have today, who are looking for big ideas or policies to organise around. Furthermore, DIY culture itself offers multiple case studies in what people will actually do when they're given the luxury of free time. The answer being that, as well as entertain themselves and each other, people choose to build networks of solidarity, care and mutual aid. Read together, DIY and UBI make a compelling argument for a brighter future. Now is the moment to bring them onto the same page. So that's the article. And I'm happy to send it out if people would like a copy of it, or happy to discuss any of the points a bit more now as well.
Yeah, that's great, Andy. Like it's I've actually got a copy of the book, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. So it's great to hear it. But no, I think that the point you make about anxiety replacing things is really important. I know, but like Mark Fisher said, but yeah, but I guess like we've replaced boredom with anxiety now, haven't we? And I think yeah, just through the constant being online and all that kind of stuff. But I think, yeah, you make a good point about how people will create their own fun and create solidarity between each other if they've got more free time. And I think the pandemic has shown us that with sort of mutual aid sort of things and stuff like that, that people will trust each other. But it's that whole thing, isn't it, of the you know, does it last beyond the crisis? You know, I guess I always use the example of that thing of, you know, when the fire alarm goes on and in the middle of the night and you all end up talking to your neighbors who you've never spoken to, and then once the fire alarm stopped, then you all go back in and ignore each other again. But I think, yeah, UBI would potentially foster a better environment for that.
And that's the upside of being in perennial crisis. But I mean, I'd be interested to kind of like, because I suppose I wrote that, you know, really just trying to add a bit of a human dimension to arriving at UBI and sort of like where it sort of came from. And it's a specific kind of music scene, I suppose, that I've been involved in. And I wondered if kind of people like Momoko and Arun and Rona maybe come from, you know, that are also involved in that practice, but, you know, felt or identified with that idea of the music communities they're involved in being that sort of like support network, or seeing examples of how people use their spare time.
Well, I mean, music is a very, it's one of those jobs that you kind of have to consider it a hobby until it actually starts paying. I mean, that's what it's been like for me as a disabled musician. You know, it's one of those things where you do a lot of performing for nothing or for virtually nothing, until you get to a point where you can say, well, look, this is my fee. And now I'm an old lady and I could say, well, this is my fee. Yeah, but if you were young and starting out and you're, you know, say you've just left school, you're 18 years old, you can't say this is my fee because you're just starting. So if you have a UBI, you don't necessarily have to worry about whether you're going to get paid for the gig or not. You have this UBI to sustain you. In the old days, believe it or not, it used to be the dole. It used to be our fragmented social security system that musicians used to use as a kind of a starting point for them. I mean, the actual band UB40, that was an unemployment benefit 40 form. I mean, these days, universal credit, it's unrecognizable, but in those days, UB40, Dire Straits, just look at the names of some of the bands. So, yeah, I mean, it's obvious that we need a replacement for that. Well, I don't, because I'm an old lady, as I said, but for people who are just starting out, it's crucial. Because, I mean, I don't want to sort of keep ranting about this government, but they managed to use the pandemic as a way of snuffing out the arts. And the arts, you can't snuff out the arts. The arts are coming back, pandemic or not, the arts are coming back. But what you need to do is you need to have a kind of diversity of arts. You need to have what you represent, Andy, the kind of DIY ethic, the whole punk ethic, the whole
Oh, it's a shame we've just lost Rona at an important moment. Maybe she'll come back on that. I think not to second guess what Rona was saying, but I suppose just that idea that there are different sorts of music scenes and different understandings of that moment where you're doing something for free or when you're doing something that you get paid for is sort of generational and interesting as well. And that maybe the making it completely commercial does squash the kind of diversity of the type of practice, not just who's involved in it, but the type of art that's made. I mean, Momoko and Aaron, is that a kind of, just look at you as what look like slightly younger people might be projecting onto you? Is that what's going off in London at the moment? Is there kind of like, is there sort of a scene of people creating these spaces for experimentation, or do you feel sort of pressured into following a certain sort of route with it?
Well, I think Momo might be able to speak to this more than me, just because she's been here longer than I have. But just, I guess, piggybacking off of your prompt, I think sometimes, like, I've noticed that there's this trend in sort of DIY music or do-it-yourself music, where because different skill sets are more accessible through the internet or through being able to learn it on your own, people end up kind of being generalists and being able to do a lot of the production side on their own, and kind of subverting the need for doing it with other people. Obviously not all the time, but I do think maybe like that access to DIY-ness has kind of led a bit to isolation, obviously over the past 18 months, but before that as well. So yeah, it's that kind of like interpretation of DIY from do it yourself to do it together is something that I haven't heard before, and I'm going to be thinking about more.
Cool, thanks.
Can I ask a question, Andy? I am thinking about some of the worlds in which I operate, both the kind of, I'm sure nobody but me knows much about contemporary dance here because nobody ever does, but the kind of professional contemporary dance world, but also the kind of community dance sphere. And in dance, we still call it community dance. I know it's fallen out of favor in other art forms a lot. And in both those spheres, as I understand it, over the past 40 years in particular, there's been a massive, increasingly over those 40 years, a demand for professionalization of the sector or of the sectors. And what I've been thinking about is how something like UBI and perhaps other economic interventions would require us to maybe give up the hold that some of us as professionals have over those worlds, and release some other things we might hold quite tightly to, like expertise or training. And I just wondered whether that's also occurring in music, and what you think we might need to do on kind of levels of community and kind of disciplinary practices to enable UBI to become something that we can, I think there's something going on there that I can't quite figure out for myself.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Gilly. And I'm just also sort of noticing it better to put a little, you know, sort of comment in there just about, yeah, the sort of the relationship with kind of like commercial theatre and sort of subsidised performing arts as well, and then the DIY underground sort of scene. And maybe Emma as a contemporary dancer can speak to some of that as well, and kind of in when he's presenting as well. But I think that sort of point around the professionalization and the kind of like validity of certain types of skills or certain ways of doing things, I think is like really what I've always loved about the DIY or the underground or the self-organized or whatever you want to call it, community sort of scene, is that, yeah, a lot of the time it does have that sort of like a completely different register for what you consider quality to be. And kind of like, you know, that's what punk and kind of like, you know, the sort of even the MTV version that I'm sure is what got me into it. It was, you know, whatever, Kurt Cobain or someone saying you don't have to be able to play the guitar well, it's just having the passion to do it. And that sort of, you know, if you, yeah, that bit probably gets forgotten quite a bit now as the kind of neoliberal agendas have sort of been sort of pushed even further. And I mean, just from my perspective, I'm sort of quite excited about it, but this is probably getting to a much more geeky music sort of chat. But this sort of like newer sort of like London jazz scene that's coming out, I really love. And there's kind of some interesting bands that are like playing, like Black Midi and kind of Black Country New Roads and kind of like different sort of acts that are coming out of the sort of Peckham London jazz scene that are like great, but they're all from music school. So they're kind of making this like really amazing music that like speaks a lot to me, but they're also trained musicians, which are kind of like is weird for me, thinking about what it was like going to Leeds in 1999, going to the upstairs of the pub, just seeing some guys, you know, that probably just didn't really know what they were doing, but like had this amazing approach to their instrument or whatever, and kind of like feeling a bit kind of like, oh, that's opened up my world. I don't have to be a trained person to do this. And as those spaces get colonized by kind of the professionals or by the trained people, I wonder about where that space ends up going. But at the same time, I'm seeing like I was talking about in the article, I suppose, a movement towards those DIY spaces being just much more focused on like, really, okay, who's coming along to this? You know, we've got a problem with whiteness in our DIY spaces. How accessible are they for people with disabilities? What can we be doing about that? And like, yeah, artists like Alan Cortis, who does some really interesting work with arts and disability, I think is doing his most exciting work in those spaces where there's a meeting of the DIY sort of, you know, punk noise approach where there's no rules, disabilities and sort of and space, and the music that's coming out of that is genuinely really, really exciting. And that's kind of like, you know, sorry, I'm losing a bit of connection there, aren't I? And I say people with disabilities because that's how they like to be referred to within that group. But I think that's probably, unless there's other sort of conversations that we might like to have.
Yeah, before it was just great to see you get so excited, Andy, if nothing else. But I think, yeah, there's quite a lot there, but I'm just conscious of time. So, and I'm sure a lot of this will contribute to the next presentation as well. So, yeah, do you want to go for it, Emanuele?